Hello, everyone. I'm Forrest North. This is our Telo Talks. And today I have with me our investor and advisor friend, Andy Palmer. Andy Palmer was the COO at Nissan Renault, grandfather of the Leaf, start of the electric revolution, and then also CEO at Aston Martin.
I prefer the term that some people use, which is godfather rather than grandfather.
Godfather.
Grandfather makes me sound a little old, but it's
Right.
true that I led the Nissan Leaf. Not the first electric car by a long way, but one might say that it was the first mass production electric vehicle on a bespoke platform. And as you know, during its time, it was very successful, more successful than all of the other EVs combined. So I think it at least deserves a place in history in terms of that transition, along perhaps with the Mitsubishi i-MiEV and of course the Tesla S.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have been driving that Nissan Leaf from the very first second that I could buy it, which was April of 2011. And I'm still driving that Nissan Leaf. I still have it. Got 95,000 miles on it.
Wow.
And I had wanted an EV since I was could know about vehicles in 20 years ago, before the Leaf. And so what attracted to me was that it was the first real mass manufacturing, so that I could be guaranteed that it was going to work, and that was a big attraction to me.
Yeah, well, it was a very intense product, and it looks like it was born out of nowhere. But as a point of reality, Nissan had been playing around with EVs mainly to meet Californian regulations. But it had, within the deep depths of the advanced engineering, it had done a lot of work. That all said, it still cost us the thick end of $4 billion to bring it to market. It was a seminal product when it was launched, and it had pretty much all the technology that Nissan knew about thrown at it. And like you, I have a 2011 version on my drive.
Yeah.
My batteries need a bit of refurbishment, it must be said, but it is a phenomenal motor car.
I must say, I did warranty my battery at 5 years, just snuck under the line, and so that was 5 years ago, but nothing else has ever gone wrong on it. I've literally spent $0 on. I finally changed the tires, I think, at 80,000 miles.
Debunking the argument that EVs create a lot of tire dust and brake dust. Of course they do, but not a lot. It's no more than any other car, and it might well be less. Yeah, I look at that car was launched in 2010 in Japan. It was then replicated, or largely replicated. We used more steel in the car for the US and the UK, but we also replicated the lithium battery manufacturing plants both in the US and in the UK. So it was a very important and very significant investment that Nissan made in trying to create that pivot towards electrification.
Can you talk a little bit about how hard it was to kind of get that started within a company that was really, completely ICE engine? When did the philosophy go to this could be something that we could do and is something that the future needs, to the impetus and the internal champions to make it happen? Like, what was that process like?
Well, internal champions is very important. Nissan is a relatively conservative company, so perhaps all the more surprising that it did a vehicle like that Leaf. And I wish I could say, hand on heart, that it was born out of basically creating a green product to save the earth. That wasn't where it started. It started because Nissan was, excuse my expression, but Nissan was getting its ass kicked by Toyota Prius in that C segment, in that mid-range segment. That
they're trying to hopscotch to like the
exactly. I was getting, among other things, I was responsible for planning of Nissan and product planning specifically, but I was also responsible for sales and marketing. In that context, my sales guys, particularly my Japanese sales guys in Japan, were screaming that they didn't have a foil to the Prius. and they wanted a Nissan Prius. They desperately wanted a hybrid, and to me, it didn't sit right. I felt that we would just be creating a Me Too, and it wouldn't say anything about Nissan. It certainly wouldn't play to what was then, and I believe still is, the brand identity or the brand slogan of innovation that excites. It would just be a follower product. As it happens, Honda did follow. They followed with something called the Insight.
My mom had that car.
Yeah. A lot of people did, but it wasn't a great success. It certainly didn't really challenge the Prius. My view was that we needed to create something that would leapfrog, that would go take the technology another step. Fortunately, when I first moved to Japan, I was responsible for light commercial vehicles, which were losing money. They heaped the other car that lost money, which was the Californian compliance car, with me. So I had quite a lot of insight into what Nissan could do around EVs. And it struck me as the next logical step was either going to be plug-in hybrids or EVs. And we managed to put a case together along with the head of R&D, who was a great advocate. We managed to persuade Carlos Ghosn that this was the right step. Without Carlos Ghosn's support, I think it would have been killed. There was certainly a lot of backlash in the company, a lot of resistance, particularly from some very senior people around the executive table that just saw this as an experiment which cost them a lot of money, was never going to be profitable, not in the first couple of generations. And there was a lot of push, strangely, specifically from areas other than just Japan, but there was a lot of pushback.
What kind of pushback, and why do you think that was?
I mean, self-interest partly. A lot of sales guys in the regions, they have their bonuses linked to contribution margin. The Leaf's contribution weighed on that performance. So if you will, the more Leaf they sold, the less likely they were to get their bonus. So there's a starting point.
Yeah.
Now you can engineer bonuses, and we did engineer. In fact, what we did was we created a business unit for zero emission vehicles, and we essentially carved out from the regions the responsibility for Leaf. We still sold it through the regions, but the accountability for the profitability fell within the business unit. So that's how we resolved that particular issue. There were also those people that were, hybrids is the future, or it's easier to sell a hybrid than it is to sell a Leaf. There were those that said maybe the future technology should be hydrogen. I think that's already proven not to be the case. There are inevitably, it's just big, maybe small as well, but big corporations, you rarely reach consensus in something, and you need a champion. And we needed the champion of the CEO, and we got the champion of the CEO, at least during the development of the Leaf and the launch of Leaf. And we were able to see it to fruition.
And he was quite passionate about it. I actually, one of the reasons I was obviously involved with electric cars was I was the leader of the Stanford Solar Car Project. And Carlos Ghosn came to the Stanford Solar Car Project after I had graduated, when the Leaf was coming out, and I had my Leaf there, and Carlos Ghosn was there pointing at my Leaf, talking to a crowd of mobility enthusiasts at the Solar Car Project, and he was so proud of it and so excited about it, and talking about how many they were going to make too. Like, I think that was one of the things that came out in the early days. That Nissan talked about making 500,000 a year. Like, they were really talking about making real numbers, which was why I started PlugShare. Like, after I heard that, I was like, okay, EVs are here. What we need now is charging. And so I went and started PlugShare basically because of what I heard Carlos Ghosn say.
And, ultimately that will prove to be correct. It's, I think we overestimated the volumes. I mean, they were good, but they weren't good enough.
Yeah.
Or perhaps we underestimated the difficulty of the pathway to profitability, because obviously profitability is always going to be one of the drivers of future and further investment. We certainly underestimated the industry's resistance to moving towards EVs, and we underestimated the importance of developing infrastructure. And the infrastructure wasn't something that we could see a pathway through. We saw the need to do it with partnerships. We did do a fast charger, actually, and we sold quite a number of fast chargers, but we perhaps didn't do it with the same passion that Tesla did when they rolled out their chargers. We did it from a point of view of trying to use a standard plug and benefit the if you will, the whole of the industry rather than a specific plug for our particular vehicle. And I don't know ultimately whether that was the right decision. We were obviously advocating for CHAdeMO, but CHAdeMO was a Japanese system that we thought was the best system for rolling out across the world. Ultimately, that wasn't the case. There are at least 4 or 5 different types of plugs that are in existence. Ghosn was important in terms of that advocacy, in giving the air cover to making it happen. Ultimately, you see that because after I left the company, we were in mid-flight of a debate about the third vehicle. Second vehicle was the NV200. Third vehicle was an Infinity vehicle. In my very last executive committee meeting, I was pushing very hard for the approval of that vehicle. The naysayers in the room basically managed to get a stay of execution to that decision. And I wasn't in the follow-up meeting. I wasn't there to push it through. Had it been, I'd hoped there was a different result, but the product was cancelled, as were all future rollouts of EVs, which was a big pity because if you look at it now, Nissan had a huge lead in EVs. We'd perhaps be talking about Nissan in the same revered terms that we talk about Tesla. Imagine Infinity in 2014 had gone EV. Imagine the impact that would have had on the premium market, which 10 years later still doesn't really have very many EVs there. So that's what happens, if you will, where the umbrella, the air cover is there to get something done and is mandatory. But when that air cover disappears, and clearly Mr. Ghosn must have been persuaded that it was better to delay the Infinity and the future vehicles to see how the market matured. Once you lose that, you lose the impetus, you lose the advantage. And frankly, Nissan is almost nowhere now in terms of that race towards electrification.
Yeah, and my personal experience at PlugShare, I mean, there's the air cover which allowed the Leaf to kind of get out the door, which I think is amazing. We were trying to get data as a Leaf driver and as the founder of PlugShare. We had this data of where all the chargers were, and it wasn't in the dash of the Leaf. It was a very rudimentary amount of chargers in there. And when we would talk with Nissan, we basically would get the comment back that there was one infotainment layer that dealt with whatever, tens of hundreds of millions of cars around the world. And there was a tiny sliver of EVs. And so you're trying to change this layer and they have to make sure that it works. Like their number one job is it has to work for all those other vehicles. And so it was just really difficult to figure out how to get that data through. And then the car companies too were really kind of had this fenced mentality around the data. And so your car would have to communicate back to Japan to get the data upload to come back. So there's this lag. If you had a German car, it would go to Germany. They wouldn't just go to the cloud and update your charging station map. I mean,
one of the advantages and disadvantages of big companies like Nissan and the Germans and what have you is that in general, there is a huge amount of governance around the quality of whatever it is you're doing. The consequence of that, of course, is you can be slow. It's difficult to be agile. The big advantage that Tesla had, perhaps still has, with things like over-the-air updates, and that's something that they really pioneered, was the ability to move quick. But you also have a greater appetite to risk. The sort of view that you can put stuff out there, see how it goes, and if it doesn't go particularly well, you can send a patch. That fundamental mentality is very different between the two types of companies, the legacy companies and the startup companies. And I'm not advocating for one or the other. I'm just identifying the difference between the two. It's certainly true. I mean, I'll give you maybe a better example of that. Nissan was very conservative when it launched the Leaf with the type of chemistry that it used in the battery. It could have gone to a higher energy density material, an NMC material, but it chose not to because it was aware of the risk of combustion. It was a risk of the difficulties of protecting batteries in that sense. It was very conscious of the nail test in China and making sure in a very purist way that we passed it. And we chose to take a more conservative approach. The consequence of that, of course, was it limited the range. And one could say that perhaps one of the weaknesses of Leaf is its relatively limited range. True. On the other hand, to the best of my knowledge, there has never been a battery fire on a Nissan Leaf in all of those years and over all of those vehicles launched. So what's the right answer? I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, just there are two completely different philosophies there.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked another time about the connection between Nissan and Renault, and how the Renault is making the Zoe and Nissan's making the Leaf, and you'd think you must have these economies of scale and you must share all these parts, and it's going to be this wonderful two vehicles out of one program.
Not at all. It's one of the secrets at the time. I mean, we often, and again, Carlos Ghosn often presented the alliance, as it was called, the Renault-Nissan alliance, as the perfect or near perfect alternative to merger and acquisition. He pointed rightly to the fact that most mergers and acquisitions in the auto world don't work very well. Mercedes, Chrysler would be just one example off the top of your head, but you could find many where it sits uncomfortably and the two cultures of the two companies don't come together. And what Ghosn, I guess, Schweitzer tried to do was reimagine how that might work, keeping the two strong identities, but having them work in an alliance that allowed both to thrive. Ghosn interpreted that as if you were trying to do something, whilst you might have a compromise between the partners, both partners needed to have yes. Both partners needed to have an advantage. As we know, that's often impossible. And if that's your corporate behavior, it's impossible to police. So whilst Nissan went first, and I would argue probably Nissan had the deeper technical knowledge around electric vehicles, and it launched the Leaf about a year ahead of the Zoe. You would have thought, and I'm sure in another type of merged culture, I don't know, Stellantis or something like that, that platform would have been imposed on the vehicles that followed. But whilst the and perhaps largely due to Ghosn's strength of character, whilst Renault agreed with the philosophy of EV, they believed in the philosophy, they didn't believe in the execution. They wanted a B-segment car. Leaf was a C-segment car, and to use European type of expression. So Zoe was a smaller car. We in Nissan very, very clearly believed that you needed to have the battery technology in-house, right or wrong, but we saw it as a replacement of the engine. Renault, on the other hand, saw the battery as a commodity that you should buy from an expert. And so they ended up buying basically the batteries from LG. We believed in the use of a fairly conventional motor with rare earth, a conventional type of magnet. They believed that there was a supply chain risk with that kind of technology, and it was better to go with an electromagnet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, what you ended up with was two vehicles completely separated with one common part, and that one common part was a connector. That was it. Now, at one moment, I did go back to Ghosn and say, do you want me to stop the Leaf program, pause it for 3 months while we work on imposing a greater level of commonality? And he said no. He said he wanted it, for him, it was important speed to market. And so we ended up with two completely different CapEx regimes and not getting any of the synergy that one would have expected from essentially the $4 billion of investment that was made. Crazy.
Yeah. So is that really 2 billion each? Is that kind of did it break down to like 2 billion Renault, 2 billion Nissan, or was it?
No, I don't know how. I don't remember how the breakdown. The majority of the spend was certainly on Nissan, but it was still a fairly significant amount. And both companies, in the ideology of the alliance, where you get synergies, you would have expected there to be synergies. I mean, the alliance talked a lot about platform sharing. The PR spin and the reality were often different things. And that is now manifestly true. You saw what happened to Ghosn, you saw the coup d'etat that happened, and you know the reasons for it. So basically, what I can conclude from that is that a loose alliance doesn't work and is far more devastating ultimately than probably a mergers and acquisitions. And probably we haven't found the perfect form for bringing companies together. And maybe the perfect form doesn't exist. What's for sure is it ain't alliance.
It reminds me of when I was at Tesla, we were working on the Roadster. The story that was told to investors was we were going with Lotus to manufacture it. And it was, that shared a lot of parts with the Lotus Elise. A lot of people for a long time said it was just, a Lotus Elise with a different styling. But in reality, the only thing that it shared was the windshield. Every single other part was different. The chassis, the rails were different, the structure was different, the panels were different, all the electronics were different. I mean, there was just nothing shared.
So you probably worse of both worlds, right? You have the constraints and the cost.
Yeah, fascinating how that kind of works out. Well, maybe going back over to the UK, how was it going from this massive company and spearheading being the godfather of the Leaf, spearheading it, pushing it through as an internal champion with that air cover, then going to Aston Martin, kind of going back into ICE engines and building new factories and launching new lines. What was that transition like?
It was big. I have to fill in a bit of background. When I was 14 years old, my dad bought me a scrapped A-series engine, which is the engine that was in the original Issigonis Mini. And that enticed my desire, my love of engineering. So from 14 years old, I was lucky enough to know that I wanted to be an automotive engineer. And the quickest way for me to get there was to leave school at 15 and start an apprenticeship when I was 16, become a draftsman. And I left my apprenticeship at 20 years old. It was right in the middle of what was terrible industrial relations. It was the Red Robbo era, the British Leyland. Everybody was on strike all of the time. It was essentially what destroyed the British car industry. And as a 20-year-old looking at this, because it was what was called a closed shop, you had to be a member of the union if you're a member of staff. This frustration of being called out on strike constantly. And I looked at it and think, ultimately management and workforce have the same goals, fundamentally the same goals. They want the company to be successful. One, because it pays shareholders and pays the salaries of the bosses, but at the same time, the staff want it to succeed because it's their livelihood, and therefore the inconsistencies are much less than the consistencies. And I couldn't understand how what I ultimately said wasn't a union problem; it was a management problem. Why that couldn't be resolved? And so, at the age of 20, as a guy that had just finished his apprenticeship, I arrogantly had this ambition that I wanted to be the CEO of a car company. Mm-hmm. And I'm a stubborn bastard. That lived with me forever. So that now projected forward to 2014 so 2013. I've become the COO of Nissan. I think it's reasonable to say that I could legitimately say number two, maybe it's certainly in the top three of the company. But going for all the reasons we know now, around the pressures he was under from the French government for Renault to consume Nissan, the pressure from the Japanese government to keep it independent because Nissan, translated from Japanese, is Japanese industries. It's the pride of Japan. For political reasons, Ghosn did something that for me was counter to everything that he taught me. So he'd always taught me about the importance of meritocracy, that your passport doesn't matter. It's all about your capability. But he went out to the press in, I think, early 2014 and said, the successor to me at Nissan will be Japanese, and probably the successor to me in Renault will be French. And to me, look, I may never have made it to the CEO's position. I may not have been good enough in a meritocratic relationship, but it cut that path off. So suddenly, it didn't matter how well I performed, I was never going to make that 20-year-old's dream come true. And about the same time, the shareholders of Aston Martin approached me and said, would you be interested in becoming the CEO of Aston Martin? The Italian shareholders had recently bought in. I knew a little bit about Aston Martin because Nissan had actually taken a look about whether it should buy Aston Martin as a brand to sit above Infiniti. We had Datsun, we had Nissan, we had Infiniti, but we didn't have the cherry on the cake. And so we'd done quite a lot of due diligence. So I knew where the bear traps were. I knew where the problems were, where the bodies were buried from that due diligence. I knew it was going to be a tough job. But I also felt those years in the industry had equipped me and taught me to take on that challenge. I felt that being a Brit to something in an iconic British company was important. And importantly, it could fulfill my 20-year-old's dreams. And so it was perhaps the hardest decision of my life, although it didn't take me very long because the rationale was clear. I loved my job at Nissan, but my 20-year-old's dream was more important to me. And so I took the decision to take the role at Aston, much smaller role, but in many respects a much harder role. Being the top of the pile is a very lonely position. You can't blame anybody else. You can't really go and seek the advice of anybody else. And every mistake that you make, you're accountable for, or every mistake the company makes, you're accountable for. It was a part of my education that I really needed, and it fulfilled a dream. It fulfilled an itch, if you will. But I think the most important point was I could bring to bear the skills that I'd learned for this iconic company. And the good news is that the car company is still there today. Aston Martin still exists.
Yes.
When I arrived in 2014, October the 1st, 2014, there was a very, very real danger that Aston was going bust by the end of the year. And it didn't. And I take pride in the fact that, and whilst I'm sure I did some good things and did some bad things, the most important thing is that Aston Martin still exists today.
What were some of the immediate, kind of steps you had to take to turn the ship?
So the biggest issue was that the guys had taken out a loan with a covenant, and the covenant meant that you had to achieve a certain level of EBITDA was the measure. When I arrived, it took me a couple of weeks to find out where we actually were. But what was clear in the first CFO report to me was that, well, number one, he was leaving, and secondly, that we didn't have the forecast that would get us above that covenant, and therefore we'd have to put the company into administration. That wasn't the news I was expecting to hear. What can you do in 3 months? Not a lot, but you can do something. And so during the course of those 3 months, I would say two big things, two big actions. One was dramatic cost reduction, cost saving. So save as much cash as you want. But remarkably, the other was my little story about James Bond saving the company. Because what we had developed for the film, which ultimately became Spectre, was the DB10. The DB10, of course, was a car for what would become the Vantage. Because we made a decision that that design style would become the future Vantage, we could capitalize the development of the Bond car, the DB10, and that was enough to raise us above the covenant line and get us into a position that we could continue. At the same time, the third point was basically write the plan to turn the company around. So at the end of January 2015, I presented to the board what ultimately became the second century plan, which was basically 7 cars in 7 years, and was the start of the development of the DB11, the next generation Vantage, the DBS, but most importantly, the DBX, the SUV, and ultimately the Valkyrie, which was basically to say we need a company that is not just reliant on front-engined sports tourers, but we need to learn from Ferrari and basically have a mid-engine range of vehicles, but also learn from the likes of Porsche, the importance of Cayenne to Porsche. What I discovered was that, first of all, about 97% of Aston's customers were male, no females. So how do you appeal to a greater audience? And secondly, I think the number was 84% of our customers had an SUV in their garage. Normally it was something like a Land Rover, a Range Rover. Why couldn't we have a bit of that action in the same way that Porsche was having a bit of that action? And that became the genesis of the DBX. So what you see was I was taking learnings from the career in Nissan, and in particular around product planning and the importance of the customer, and I was bringing that to bear in Aston, having secured enough time to get through the covenant and actually raise 200 million of debt to basically get us through to the first vehicle, which was the DB11. The 200 million of debt wasn't enough in itself, but we invented the specials. And so you saw the genesis of vehicles like Vulcan, being born, and the GT12 and the GT8. Those were vehicles that we could move quite quickly because they were based on an existing platform, and that brought in money that we could then use as working capital to get to DB11. DB11 paid for Vantage, Vantage paid for DBS, DBS paid for DBX, and DBX paid for Valkyrie. So ultimately, we were running on a tight budget, but having a clear plan of how the company would grow allowed us to execute it.
That's amazing. But it really started with that just kind of being a bit saved by a James Bond bump. Like, how did that come to pass, and what did you guys do to make sure that you kind of cemented that or amplified that?
We had a long relationship with Barbara and Michael, who run the Bond franchise. The team had done quite a lot of work in terms of securing a car in that movie. That was largely okay as long as we could deliver it, and we had the money to deliver it, which was more my brief, I suppose. But it was also important that we therefore evolved the Vantage from that vehicle, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to capitalize. So I guess that was the key. When we moved to Bond 25, which was the last Bond movie, that was a difficult conversation, actually. There was a moment where the first director that was recruited basically really wanted to change the way that Bond was portrayed, as far as I understand it, and there wasn't going to be a car in that movie. It wasn't that Aston wasn't going to be in the movie, there wasn't going to be a car in that movie. That fortunately changed with the change of director, and in fact we ended up putting 4 cars in that movie. I think it's the most ever vehicles that went into a Bond movie, and was great because it included Valhalla. Valhalla is the natural follower of the mid-engine bloodline that's created by the Valkyrie. So it has the Valhalla in there, it had the DBS in there, it had my favorite Aston, which is the V8 Vantage, and of course wouldn't be a Bond movie without DB5.
Very cool. And then how many, I think you told me before, like how many did you have to make to like do those shots, and you could do them without the interiors, so like black cloth inside? And
there were only 2 complete vehicles, but there were 10 part vehicles, and part of the naming of DB10, as you know, if you went DB7, there was no DB8, there was a DB9, there was no DB10, and there was a DB11. And so what we did was we filled in the gap with the DB10. But it happens that there was 10 vehicles that were made partial. It's fascinating. Filmmaking is fascinating. So, for example, for some of the scenes where you see Bond drifting the car, it's actually a driver sat on the roof in a little cage with a steering wheel that's actually driving the car and doing those fantastic stunts.
That sounds even scarier.
It does sound remarkably scary, doesn't it? But the 2 cars that were built were for the movie were amazing. They're space frame. They're a space frame with a scanned DB5 body that was then used to create essentially plastic panels. We used, I think it was a BMW inline 6 engine because we wanted to create as close to the authentic sound of the engine. And as you know, the DB5 was an inline 6. It looked like for sure it looked like a DB5, and all the gadgets were added, and it sounded like a DB5, and it drove quite a lot better than a DB5. Actually, it was a very good car, but it was purely for the movie. There were authentic DB5s that were also used in the movie where you needed the beauty shots, but all of those ones that did the stunts, they were all mock-ups.
That's amazing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, did you feel like coming from the Leaf program that there was going to be a place for an EV in this new company, or was that as part of the future plan? Or
that's 7 cars in 7 years. The 6th and the 7th car in the plan were to be a brand called Lagonda. Some of you may know the brand. It's a very old British brand. It was a brand that essentially competed in the very high luxury sedan era or area. I suppose you would say that it competed directly against a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley. I wanted to make that brand electric, full electric, 100% electric, and that would sit and compete with cars like Rolls, because ultimately a Rolls and a Bentley is striving for silence, whereas a Lagonda, being an EV, would be automatically silent. So it was a no-brainer. Yeah. But we also wanted to make it quite a radical model, and we showed at Geneva both car number 6 and car number 7 and that would have been Aston's bet, if you will, on the full electrification model. And my philosophy at that stage was that Aston would go down the plug-in hybrid route, as it ultimately did with the DBX, but would also cover bets, if you will, on synthetic fuel, because I'm a great believer that the customers of something like an Aston or a McLaren or those of Ferrari might be prepared to pay a high price per gallon for fuel as long as it met that zero emission requirement. That might be a bet, but you couldn't put it on it because you might get it wrong. Legislators could easily turn around and say the e-fuel is not legal, or you might get consumers saying it's not clean or whatever. So by having a Lagonda with EV and having Aston with plug-in hybrid becoming synthetic, if something changed, you could switch the powertrains. That was the philosophy we were working on until we understood the trends towards electrification much better. That transition to electrification is not, as I knew from my days at Nissan, it's not simple. So we created a vehicle called the Rapide. The Rapide existed in ICE form, but I created an EV version of that, which we got basically to fruition, but didn't get to sales. And I know that I asked one very famous journalist. He's the only journalist that ever drove that vehicle, drove it on a track, and his verdict at the end of it was the best EV that he'd driven to date. So there was an evolving capability towards EV with a view of getting to Lagonda. But after I left the company, to my understanding, the program for other reasons was cancelled.
That's a shame. Going from the big company in manufacturing to the low volume, like what could we learn from, what did you learn in that transition? What do you see in the kind of low volume, factory build? I know that you guys put together several factories that seem like they're much lower cost than any factories that I've heard from the big automakers.
Yeah. There are merits and demerits of big companies and large companies. My marketing budget in Nissan was something like $4 billion a year. My marketing budget when I came to Aston was £12 million, just in a different place. I had more front covers with Aston than I ever had with Nissan. So it's a matter of how you work the cash. If you are building a factory in Nissan, for some logical reasons, by the way, but you'd probably be talking about hundreds of millions. Factory that we built in Wales for the DBX was something like £25 million net. And to some extent, you can do what you can do with the money that you've got. So when you're a small company, sometimes you have to be more innovative in the way that you spend the money. You find compromises, you find ways of doing things. Sometimes they're imperfect, but you find ways of doing things. If it was a Nissan, you'd find a piece of land, you'd flatten it, and you'd build a factory from the ground up. I couldn't afford to do that, so I took an existing building and turned it into a car factory on an airport. So those are some of the compromises that you come to. On the other hand, look, there are some things that I learned at Aston that I only wish I knew about when I was at Nissan, particularly things around the use of carbon fiber, and particularly in things other than simple A surfaces, non-structural. Carbon fiber is also a wonderful structural material that is sometimes could have been used. I could easily imagine of using more carbon fiber in something like the GTR than we actually ended up, which is predominantly high-strength steel. So Aston just does that technology so much better. It's so much more innovative, pushes the edges a bit more, and has become an expert in that level of technology. Likewise, to some extent in aluminum, Aston is far more advanced, or was far more advanced than Nissan in the technology, particularly of bonding aluminum together. So there are pros and cons, and one of the things that I've enjoyed most about my career has been the ability to move between segments and sizes of company, and along the way learned a lot. I've learned a lot about batteries from chairing companies that make cells, chairing companies that make packs, chairing companies that make battery management systems, chairing car companies. By looking at the problem from different viewpoints, you get a much better understanding of the challenges, but your ability to make rational decisions and good decisions becomes higher. And that's one of the things that I've enjoyed most about the diversity of my career.
You really have had an amazing career over over continents.
A few years.
What about on the dealership side? Did you have any at Nissan? Or Nissan Renault? Were you involved at all with the kind of the dealership network, or was that kind of separate? And then I'm assuming at Aston Martin you probably had much more interaction with that.
Yes and no.
How are they different?
Yes, for example, Nissan owned its own dealership network in Japan, but it franchised it in most places outside of Japan.
Yeah.
I was responsible for sales and marketing as a central function, but it was the regions were run by the regional vice presidents. They ran the sales franchise business, and the relationship with the dealerships was in many cases much more adversarial. It was more of a transaction type basis. In Aston, on paper, Aston's dealership network pretty much replicated that. The only dealership that we owned was the Aston Martin Works dealership. Everything else was franchised, so it looked fairly similar. But the reality was Aston obviously had a much fewer dealers. I knew them all, and you had a personal relationship with them. So, honestly, on more than one occasions when we needed cash, we could look for support from the dealership networks that would push more sales than perhaps they would naturally have done. So the relationship was one of much more of collaboration. In the other way too, I mean, in the first 4 days of my tenure at Aston, I went to Paris Motor Show, then I flew to the US and I met the US dealers. I said to them, free choice, what do you want? What if your fairy godmother came along and gave you a wish, what would you wish for? And what they said was they wished for the continuation of a manual transmission, a stick shift, in American terminology. And so I committed to give them a stick shift. Sure enough, I delivered on the Vantage stick shift for the US market. That was an example of the collaboration. I did what I would say that they wanted, and they helped me in return. And I would say that the relationship, because it was much smaller and because you knew everybody, the relationship with the Aston dealers was a good one.
When I was doing, both PlugShare and at Tesla, we interviewed dealerships, and I guess I hadn't realized how heavily they were based on service, and that seemed to be a pretty big barrier to them promoting EVs, because they essentially had moved away from really making a lot of margin on the vehicle and just getting a pretty high margin on their service centers. And the Leaf really is not coming into the service center besides the battery warranty. Is there a way around that you see, or is there some other model you've seen working, or is that true in every country? Is that the same in the UK? Is that more of a service model? Have they all moved that direction?
A lot of car companies have moved moved away from the franchise system. I'm not sure whether it's the right move, and you're starting to see even a slight reversal of that. What I think is important with between OEMs and franchise dealers is alignment. And I mean, one of the issues you have is that the car company worries about its profitability, and the dealer group worries about its profitability, and sometimes the two aren't aligned. What is true is that as we move to electrification and move to EV, to my mind at least, is as sure as death and tax. You also have to move the profitability model. You have to move the revenue generation. For sure, it changes. For sure, you've got less moving parts in an EV, and generally speaking, it's fair to say you should have greater reliability. So the parts and service side of the business will reduce. So you've got to look at other means of revenue generation, and there are examples of that. I mean, particularly around software, as an example, and therefore your interrelationship with the dealer, you can make a much tighter relationship because the cars are connected. I think we need to rethink that system so that you've got that alignment. In general, I think that the franchise system is probably the best one, where the car company concentrates on making good cars, and the franchise dealers concentrate on the customer relationship and the interrelationship with the customer and the sales of those cars. I think generally the key is alignment and the transition of that alignment across to a different type of technology.
Yeah, I agree.
We should talk about Telo. I mean, because obviously, as you rightly say, I'm one of your initial investors in the product.
Yeah. What interests you in Telo? Maybe that'd be from your experience.
Simple. So I told you about cars 1 and 2 at Nissan, the Leaf followed by the MV200, and I told you about the cancelled Infinity. The fourth car that we would have brought to market was a car called the Blade Glider.
Right.
Showed the concept of it, and it was a very narrow front end. It was a wide rear end. It was a McLaren F1-esque seating pattern, and it didn't matter. The point of Blade Glider was that as you move to electrification, the car doesn't need to be the way that the car has traditionally been. Traditionally, you've had a 3-box design because you've had the lump of engine up the front. When the engine disappears, you can change the form factors. And we made a conscious decision in both Leaf and in EMV that we copied the traditional form of the vehicle because we felt the transition to electrification was a big enough change for the customer to digest. But if you changed everything, the customer would never be able to digest that change. So we did it step by step.
Right.
But car number 4 was supposed to be a declaration to the market that in future, EVs don't need to look like 3-box sedans, that you can be much more radical in the form of the vehicle. I thought that was a really important statement. I am frustrated that the car industry hasn't moved quickly enough in having the balls to change the form factor of the cars that they sell, because cars could be so much better than they are today if only we would utilize the greater degree of freedom that an electric car gives to the designer. So what I loved about when I first was introduced to Telo was that you guys had the balls to change the form factor. Radically so. You cut the hood. Sorry, I was going to say bonnet. You cut the hood off the darn thing, and you created a completely new form factor for the most traditional of segments, the Ford F-150 segment. If you will, spiritually, I see you carrying the torch of what was that Blade Glider, and that's why I was so delighted to become involved with you guys and hopefully help see it through to fruition.
Well, I really appreciate that. We hope so too. I mean, we're building the 1-box design, and we're pretty committed to that, and we really feel like that frees up a lot of space. I love the Blade Glider. It's basically, I was talking to a friend, it's kind of Nissan's Aptera. It's like a really radical design. Did it ever come to fruition, or is there?
No, it didn't.
Totally cut.
It never got further than basically the concept. We showed it at one of the auto shows.
And it was planned to be electric. Is that true?
Yeah, it was going to be 100%. It's going to be 100% electric. Yeah. We'd mocked up the car, and I actually drove it in the test track in Death Valley. It's to this day, it reminds the most fun car that I've ever driven. It was so neutrally balanced. It drifted with ease. It probably wasn't the outright quickest car that I've ever driven. It's probably not the outright best handling car per se, but as fun. And when I originally penned over there, I've got a picture of the original concept drawing that I did. Terrible drawing, by the way, but it was originally conceived to be the Datsun 510, which was to be basically an affordable sporty car that you could just have fun with, and that was the concept. And yes, by nature, it was going to be an electric car.
So EV 4.0 is 1-box design.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually have the balls to do something different, because I think the consumer is ready for that now. Most consumers, they may like or dislike electric cars, but I think everybody accepts that they're coming. Yeah. And so now is the moment where I'd love to see car companies get a little braver in their design, a little less safe, and start to change the vocabulary of a car.
Yeah, I think cars were really starting to all look the same for a while, and trucks. So we may have kind of a Cambrian explosion of new designs, which I think is really exciting, and we certainly hope to be one of the
lead the light,
the successful ones.
Carry the torch.
Yes. Well, we love having you as an investor and advisor. I mean, it's just amazing to get your insight and advice, and it's really fun to just have this conversation, be able to share this with some of our listeners and share your experience, because it's been a really unique one.
Forrest, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and thoroughly enjoy working with you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Andy. Talk to you soon.
Take care.